welcome any objections. Any objections to me recording at my end as well? Because I'm really
no, sure.
Thank you.
No, that's all good for me. So just by brief way of introduction, Ian Holland, member of the Baha'i community here in Solihull. I'm delighted to be back here. This is for the second year. Grateful to the Preston Faith Forum for that invitation. My background is in social and economic development. I had 15 years in the UK working on various different regeneration programs in and around, up and down the country, before a second career in the United Nations. And that's resulted in me working primarily in conflict-affected countries, chiefly in Afghanistan, with other posts, for example, in Libya, in Somalia, and then more from a development perspective, mainstream development perspective in, for example, in India, in Laos, PDR, in Southeast Asia, and more recently, Thailand and Indonesia. I'm currently working on Papua New Guinea. And so a lot of my work has been associated with the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which we'll touch on tonight. But I thought that it would be quite interesting to get since this is a faith forum inspired meeting, to try to get a faith perspective on the recent COP26 conference, the climate change conference that took place in Glasgow. I know that you'll be all aware of that. And just to take a look at some of the issues that arose there, some of the things that come out of it, but more to sort of zoom out a little bit on that and to try to get a handle on what might be some of the spiritual perspectives that the faith communities might bring to that, or use as a perspective or a lens to view what's happening in the world more broadly, but using the COP as an example, exactly, if you like. So the essence of the presentation was really what can COP teach us, and how are we framing it as from a faith perspective. So with your permission, I'll probably need the organizers or the administrators' permission to share my screen. It may already have been granted. Let's have a look. Yes, you've done it already. Power to you. Can you see that okay?
Yes, thank you, Ian. That's great.
I'm going to switch to the full screen. It might take a moment or two to load.
Will will any of them be videos and sound on them?
No, I'm just going to be talking about 10 slides just to talk through briefly.
It was just about, some people forget to click the audio box if there's going to be a video. Yeah,
sure. So no videos, straightforward presentation. Welcome questions as we go through. If you like to make it interactive, just feel free to I can't see you all so clearly now. I've enlarged the screen, but just jump in if you've got any questions, or we can save them up for the end. So and I was interested in this notion that it was about the branding for the COP was about uniting the world to tackle climate change, and we'll come back to talk about that in a minute. So of the material that I'd like to cover is really to put climate change into perspective. And it's one of a number of global development challenges that we currently face. We'll take briefly a look at why it was important and what came out of the COP, because I think that's interesting too, before, as I say, taking trying to get a handle on what a spiritual perspective or a human values-based perspective is. What are some of the principles we might use as starting points for looking at what's happening, what's going on in the world, and what came out of this COP experience. So we look at a number of principles from that perspective, and then we end up with a slide at the end, which is encourages towards hope for the future, which is a really important commodity to have, I think, in any of these discussions. Briefly, and this was just to pick up the mantle from where we left off last year, which I thought was interesting. I don't want to duplicate what we talked about last year, but it also helps us to frame the discussion on climate change and the climate change challenge. And so last year we were looking at caring for the planet and where we had come from in a journey at a global level in advancing development plans. And we had this period between the year 2000, 2015, in which the world was centered on these Millennium Development Goals, these 8 goals that were ushered in up to 2015, and which most countries, but it was the so-called developing countries towards which this was oriented. And then we moved into a more broad phase called the Sustainable Development Agenda, which will take us from 2015 to 2030. And many of you may be aware of this Sustainable Development Agenda and these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we looked at this as the second phase of the era of global development planning. And we moved into a territory in which we saw, and I don't know if you can see on your screens, but where all of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals are inextricably linked. And so even if we looked at an issue like climate change, we'd see it be linked to poverty, it's linked to education, it's linked to health, it's linked to gender, it's linked to to economic development, it's linked to inequalities, and it's linked to peace, governance, and justice, and those sorts of issues. And so from whatever lens or perspective, and tonight it's the climate change, there will naturally be reverberations and implications for other parts of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that it is, and we're coming to realize how finely balanced global development and global development plans have to be, taking into perspective these various different perspectives or portals to development. But let's just home in on the issue of COP for the moment, because we said we'd center on this and use it as a bit of an example. COP, I'm sure you've probably got to grips with this by now. It's an abbreviation which stands for the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a bit of a mouthful. That in itself is reduced to the UNFCCC as a convention. It's number 26 because, believe it or not, it's the 26th meeting of the Conference of Parties. So they've been going at this. They do one every year, every 5 years more significant, because that's when the sort of real strategic planning takes place, and this was one of them. And I've had the good fortune of being involved in one of these, not from a climate change perspective, because climate change is not my technical speciality, but one when I was based in Laos. Lao PDR became the presidency of the first ever convention meeting on cluster munitions. And so it's a remarkable process to be part and parcel of, when the world comes to your country and to your nation en masse. And so every country gets represented, and there's a whole cadre, a cohort of civil society activists, organizations, private sector, academics, and so forth, all come and take conference together for a number of days. The one in Glasgow, as we know, took 2 weeks. So it's a remarkable process. This one was really looking at where we are as a global community when it comes to the urgency of taking action on climate change. So just briefly, there are 2 charts here. One on the left is really the sort of backward looking, where have we come from, where have we got to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And the one on the right is the one of where we're going and the projections looking forward. And it paints a pretty grim picture, an honest picture, but a grim picture on the challenge that we face as a global community. The axis on the left-hand graph, the vertical axis, is really charting the billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions that get put into the atmosphere as a whole. This is the sum total, the cumulative total of member states, of nation states, greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see it's been doubling and trebling even just over the last 10 or 20 years. So, and we haven't peaked yet. So if you like, that's the red warning, the alert flashing grimly on our dashboard, that we haven't even peaked at the amount, never mind talking about reducing it. And then you've got a graph on the right which shows the projected onward, not just the onward trend, the historical trend of where by 2030 we may end up being, based on these what's called the NDCs, these nationally determined contributions. These are the plans of governments that are currently in place. Not all of them fully detailed, we've got to say. Some of them are fairly aspirational, but it shows that we're on for a target by the end of the century of somewhere between 2.4 and 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise, based on the pre-industrial period. So that's not good news. That's the bottom line. That's terrifying news for those countries that are most affected. And basically, most scientists agree that would be a total calamity for the human race. So we're heading towards catastrophe, unless, of course, we manage, based on the deliberations in Glasgow, to reduce our huge greenhouse gas footprint considerably just in the next 8 years, taking us to 2030. And so there's a variety of different projections that you see there. The ultimate goal being to try to reduce it to a rise of no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. But we got a long way to go before we get anywhere near that. So that, if you like, is the baselining for the challenges. Some of what came away from the COP discussions, and there's some good little snippets and video outtakes you find on the BBC website, which are actually quite helpful, give you an infographic on some of this. But relative to our theme tonight, 2 weeks of deliberations, up to 40,000 delegates from 200 countries, plus, of course, the various different communities that were present, from the scientific, the academic, the business, civil society, and importantly, young people. With the ultimate goal, as we've mentioned there, of keeping the increase to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century within reach. But of course, we recognize that we're currently a long way away from achieving that. There was a climate pact that was struck, but I'm sure many of you are aware the disappointment that was visibly expressed by the president of the COP26 meeting, that was watered down at the 11th hour, based on the notion that coal, as the dirtiest and one of the most dangerous of the greenhouse gases, would need to be phased down rather than phased out. And I think there was a lot of discontent expressed by a number of countries and partners to the agreement that was actually diluted. But there are some good signs. Methane was agreed by a number of countries. But you have to also remember that these national pledges, there's nothing that's enforceable in them. It's a voluntary mechanism, countries agreeing by their own conscience and their own goodwill to reduce these numbers. There was a partnership between the US and China to collaborate on technologies for climate reduction. There was a refusal for reparations for the damage already caused by the Europeans and the US, since they've been putting into the environment the bulk of historic emissions. There was a funding agreement, $1 billion a year, to help countries with their adaptation. But we have to recall that was also an agreement that was made over 10 years ago in Copenhagen, but which was never realized. So we're sort of recycling old promises here if we're not careful. And of course, we heard the terrifying perspectives from countries in the Pacific Islands, in particular Bangladesh and other countries that are most affected and will be hardest hit. And it's often the poorest countries that are least well equipped, but also face the greatest challenges associated with this. But there were other deals done to seek to tackle coral reefs, deforestation, and so on. So the whole thing is quite a mixed picture. And countries now go away with an idea that they've got to sharpen their pencils and come back next year with some better action plans. But just apart from all of that, if you like, and some of it's a lot of noise coming out of Glasgow, important that some of it really is, and how meaningful it really is, and what impact it can potentially have. This is an event that's sponsored by the Preston Faith Forum, and I thought it would be interesting just for a moment to reflect on what, from a faith-based perspective or a spiritual perspective, might be interesting to look at. What are some of the foundational values that the faiths bring to this in terms of their contribution to the discussion? So I've looked at a number of documents, and this one is an interesting one. It's one that was released by the International Bahá'í Community in 1985, marking the decade of peace, entitled The Promise of World Peace, a short pamphlet. But in it, there's a very interesting paragraph which talks about spiritual principles. And it seeks to try to define what a spiritual principle is, and it encourages those people involved in development to first seek to try to identify what the core principle, the human principle is at the heart of this, and then to be guided by that in their consultations. And so a principle which is essentially spiritual in nature is one that resonates with our human nature, our true human nature, if you like, as spiritual beings, our true selves. But it also seeks to try to identify with that an attitude, a belief, or a will, if you like, the drive to be able to implement something. It's not just good enough to have the principle itself. It has to be accompanied with a force of delivery. And so I've tried to identify a few that I think sort of resonate with the spirit of the age, and which also impinge on this issue of development and climate change. So as a starting point, all of the religions, all of the great faith-based systems maintain a profound and sacred respect for creation, and all tend to see the reflections and qualities of the creator, of God, in nature and in the beauty and the glory of nature, and regard humankind as responsible stewards or custodians for that creation. And so I guess that places us in our position of responsibility for the planet, for nature, which is fundamental to climate change. And I think this goes beyond climate change. It looks at biodiversity and the environment more broadly, as it's all wrapped up in this. And then secondly is the sort of recognizing what is development from a spiritual perspective. And the Baha'i perspective here gives two dimensions to this fundamentally. One is that development is an organic process, which means it's constantly evolving. An organic process is something which grows over time, incrementally, perhaps with the seasons, in phases, in spurts, each building, each period building on the last, based on perhaps a learning process. So something organic about development as we go forward. It's not a static process. And so this is interesting when you compare that as a definition of development with the long-standing principle or definition of sustainable development that appears in the, if you like, in the UN literature. And the second is that it's about the spiritual being expressed in the material. If we are fundamentally spiritual beings, that we have some impact outwardly on the world, and that there's an inner and outer aspect to this. There's a spiritual and a material aspect to this. And the final quotation reflects a little bit the dynamic of that relationship with nature, that we're organic with the world, and as much as our inner life shapes the environment around us, whether it's from a moral perspective or a spiritual perspective, we're also deeply affected by the state of the world and the world that we're creating. And so this is a reaction that one thing is not just dependent on the other, but has an impact on the other. So that's our starting point for trying to get a grasp on what some of the spiritual or human principles for engaging in a discussion on development might be. Another is the fundamental principle, if you like, from a Baha'i perspective, and this may resonate with some of the other faith communities or even non-faith communities, that the spiritual principle of the age in which we live is that of the oneness of humankind, that we are one family inhabiting this extraordinary, fragile marble that seems to be, floating through space, and we're in a quite a precarious position with it, but fundamentally we're one human race, we're one human family. And this is sort of enshrined in this principle here, the statement of Baha'u'llah: the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. And so we need ultimately to cooperate and reciprocate in that cooperation with other members of the human family, regardless of nationality, regardless of race, regardless of religious identity, or regardless of all of the other divisions which potentially, you know, keep us apart regarding ourselves as a human family. And we all have to try to act in the interests of the community as a whole, not just in our own, you know, national interest. And so much of the political language of the age is, well, let's do what's in our national interest, and it's disregarding and often at the detriment of what's in the interests of the rest of humanity. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it was interesting to see that this conference was titled, what was it? Uniting the world to tackle climate change. And another of Baha'u'llah's expressions here is that this quest for unity is a principle. It's a starting point for being able to resolve the challenges that face us collectively as a human race. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are, in fact, unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And until we have the unity of nations, the unity of people, recognizing and moving in the same direction to tackling climate change or any other challenge for that interest, you know, we're still going to be on precarious ground. So uniting the world to tackle climate change, if that's one of the major outcomes that was achieved in Glasgow, then I think we're on the right path. And so it may be a how would you say, a preliminary unity. It may not be a fully binding and solid unity, but if we're on the path to unity, we're on the path to development. So that seems to be another principle. But beyond that, I think there's a further stage, if you like, in our maturity as a human race. And that is really looking at and understanding and appreciating, which I think we are individually and collectively doing as communities, is understanding the true nature of the interconnectedness and the interdependence of ourselves as one human family. And this is a beautiful quotation that speaks to that issue, and it's regards humanity as a single individual and one's own self as a member of that corporeal form, if you like, that human form, as if we're all members or cells of a human body, and know of a certainty that if pain or injury inflicts any member of that body, it must inevitably result in suffering for the rest. And this is a true compassionate, if you like, compassionate approach to development. And I think if we really had that truly reflected in our hearts and our deliberations, then we might accelerate the rate to which we try to support efforts towards climate change, because we recognize that the effects that climate change is already having on some populations is devastating, and it's going to hurt us as a whole. And it's not just confined to those communities that are, if you like, at the brunt end of it. And so this is raising the bar, I think, in terms of what the moral fabric or the moral framework ought to be going forward. And so I thought that was a particularly interesting perspective to come at this. And then there are two powers, I think, that we need in the world. Just check the time. I don't want to go on for too long. There are two powers that are at our disposal. One is the power of consultation. And we see this, the picture is taken of the climate change conference in Glasgow. You can see the various different countries represented there taking counsel together. And this was something that Baha'u'llah, speaking about 150 years ago, made mention of in, when we come up with challenges that we invariably face at the community level, at the city level, the national level, at the global level, taking counsel together in all matters, inasmuch as consultation is the lamp of guidance which leadeth the way and bestows understanding. And so we are invested with a tool at our disposal to use, and to the extent to which we consult, and we've seen evidence of this, and I think this is one of the telltale signs, again, of the criteria that we're on the right path here in events like this in Glasgow and others like it, is, there are certain conditions, of course, for consultation based on sincerity, on compassion, understanding, on being genuine in that sense. But we've had a more inclusive engagement, it seems, in the discussions in Glasgow. We've heard and we've seen on the stage diverse nations speaking, diverse voices, indigenous people speaking. You know, the most affected nations giving a platform and, you know, consulting amongst themselves in order to put forward more collaborative, powerful positions to the so-called rich nations to have influence. And young people too. We've had the voices of young people, and the likes of Barack Obama encouraging young people to stay angry on this issue, to stay engaged in this issue, because it's one that affects young people more than it does anybody else, arguably, because it's their world that they inherit. They inherit. I apologize. And so consultation is a good thing, and we're seeing the diversity of views engaged in that more to the game. And then there's another interesting one, which has been lamentably lacking, I think. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges. The power of implementation is needed. And this is something here that Abdul Baha, who's the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, made mention of. And it's his, it's 100 years since his passing that we're actually commemorating as Baha'is this week. Abdul Baha wrote to the organization that preceded the United Nations and the League of Nations. He wrote to the organization which before the First World War was called the Organization for an Enduring Peace. It was established in The Hague. There are parallels here between this exhortation of Abdul Baha for the need for implementation with where we stand with the climate change dilemma that we have, that we recognize there is an impending and grievous challenge that we all have to face up to, as was the situation before the First World War. And Abdul Baha noted here, he said, our desire, which you can see on the screen, is for peace, which is not merely derived from the intellect. It's a matter of religious belief and one of the eternal foundations of the faith of God. And this is something which is echoed in all of the religions of the past, that there'll be a glorious stage for humanity and that peace will ultimately be achieved. But we have to work towards it. And I think this was the point he was making here. He was saying today the benefits of universal peace, and this was written in 1920, are recognized amongst the people of the world. But a power of implementation is needed. And we didn't have the power of implementation to prevent the First World War. Less still, we didn't have the power of implementation some 25 or whatever it was years later to avoid a Second World War. And so this power of implementation must not be underestimated. And if there's a lesson that we learn from that, we need to learn it for this COP26 idea. There's a power of implementation that's needed to turn these aspirations, these promises, into practical action plans. And so he said that these lofty ideals may be translated from the realm of thought into the realm of reality. And that's one of the greatest tests, I suggest, that we face in putting these challenges that we face in turning them around into reality. So the socialization of this issue of climate change is one of the greatest goals, so that we all have a stake, we all have a responsibility, and we shouldn't just look to governments, important that is. We've all, got access to such extraordinary knowledge at our fingertips, and we all have a role as individuals. We can all take action at the local level. And my final sort of point of principle here is that we're on a journey together. We don't want to be too hard and beat ourselves up too much about this. We're on a journey together. Extraordinary progress is being achieved, and the world is sort of unrecognizable now as to the one that perhaps we lived in maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago. The pace of development is extraordinary. We're on this collective journey together, and we have an awakening of global consciousness. And this is, taking place in many different forms and sectors and parts of society. But it's certainly the case when we turn our attention to climate change. It's something that affects us all. We're living in the emergence of a world civilization. You might call it a world, the earliest glimmerings of which we may begin to see. this interconnected world in which we live in. We're recognizing ourselves as citizens of a global society, and we also have the power of individual initiative, which I've made mention of. And so there are a couple of quotations here that I think speak to this issue well, that we've all been created, all people, to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. We all have a purpose in this. We all have a purposeful opportunity to contribute to that ever-advancing civilization, that every nation, every group, every individual can make that contribution into the direction in which humanity is irresistibly moving. And so there's a destination here that we're all moving towards. And that, you know, it's right for us to be anxiously concerned with the age in which we live, whether that is climate change or biodiversity depletion, whether it's mental health and health issues, or the challenge of education, or refugees, or poverty. These are all something, you know, these are all issues that we can be engaged in. And it's that old adage about thinking globally, but acting locally. And we all have individual agency to be able to work for the betterment of the world. And the final thing, I think, is, you know, retaining an optimistic outlook, having great hope in the future, and recognizing that challenges are there to enable to make us grow, essentially, not to defeat us. That we're resilient as a species, and we're resourceful and quite remarkable, and that however difficult matters are in the present time, and however, you know, much we are pushed to our limits, and that some sections of society are truly tested in that regard, humanity, we're given this assurance, and I think this appears not just in the Baha'i writings, but in other, you know, religious and non-religious texts, that humanity will ultimately pass through this test, will pass this ordeal and emerge with much greater insight on how deeply interconnected that we are, and appreciation of that oneness. And so that's my kind of final thought for, you know, looking forward. But we're on the right flight path, but we are truly being tested, I think, in all manner of domains presently, and that the climate change challenges that we face are just one facet, one aspect of that. And as we said at the outset, very interlinked with some of the many other global challenges that we face. But the good news is we can all engage. We've got more knowledge, more access, more opportunity to engage and cooperate with each other at all sorts of levels, but especially at the local level, to be able to make some kind of a difference. So thank you very much. And any questions or thoughts on that? Absolutely most welcome.
Yes, Jeremy, you were thwarted at the beginning, so it's your turn to kick off.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ian, for a very interesting talk. It's really encouraging to hear from somebody who's had such a illustrious career, as close to the heart of all these matters. And having been to Vietnam and to Bangladesh in the monsoon, I'm sure we both can see the potential for what can go wrong. And it makes our small problems of flooding in this country just pale into complete insignificance. Looking across the Ganges in the monsoon, you can't see the other side, just this enormous wall of water moving along at something like 6 knots. And to know that there is nothing will stand in its way at all. So it's just absolutely terrifying to see what nature can do when it's set upon us. I managed to get to COP26 for a couple of days myself, and I would like to mention a couple of my own observations and ask you some questions based on them, if I may, without going on too long, Malcolm. My take on that, because it's the only one I've been to, it is a mixture of massive optimism tinged with enormous frustration. I explain my optimism in the term which I use. It's not original, I don't think. I do think the dominoes are falling faster and faster towards practical solutions. And I don't mean debated or discussed solutions, but practical implementation. But on the other hand, I'm really disheartened by the quality and direction of what passes for debate. There are still people out there who think there is a debate on the causes of climate change itself, whereas there is no serious scientific debate. So I'll gloss over that one very quickly. But so there's a problem of education for those who are influencers who need to know that's over. And as for those who know that there is no scientific debate, we're all going around think tanks and projections, and I look in despair at agencies like the International Energy Agency, the IEA, that has never failed to get a prediction wrong. Every prediction they've ever made has been linear, whereas both the problems and the solutions are likely to be exponential on both levels, whether it's the tipping points to disaster or the tipping points for the solutions that we're going to depend on to get to where we want to be, which is the best mitigation we can have. I do feel sometimes looking at this dystopian picture of the blue zone, where all the people with collars and ties got together behind helicopters in the sky and security, like some dystopian Doctor Who episode gone wrong. I got the impression they're like a bunch of cave dwellers complaining about the draft, when outside there are people clamoring to sell doors. The solutions are already among us. They are engineering solutions. They are to do with stopping burning things and moving to renewable energies and a renewable economy. And the engineering is already with us. It's simply not sufficiently widely distributed. I think it's, you said it now, the future is here, but it's not widely distributed. It's some sci-fi guy. But that's absolutely the truth when it comes to this. We do have the technology. We are able to scale it towards whether it's electric or other cars, renewable grids, better agricultural systems, rewilding. I should mention I'm greatly persuaded by the writings of a guy called Tony Seba, if you've come across him, Ian, and his think tank Rethink X. It's all doable. All we need is the politicians to lay down as much as they can in terms of clear statements, so that the engineers and the business people can pour the money into the investments, and so that we can be clear about it and think it's time for that solar roof, it's time for that electric car, or if the wait for the electric cars is 3 or 4 years, maybe I can get a classic and have that converted. And it's time for us to check, where is our pension money going? Is it going into renewable, sustainable, profitable, safe investments with the best return, or is it going to go into some stranded asset that's going to lose us money, and they're going to say it's all our fault when they don't give us a return on it? I'm desperately frustrated about those aspects, which I wondered if I could. I've given a rolled up question there. Do you accept that my general observation that the debate is simply not focused enough on the known solutions, and unless we get a clear lead, people won't know it's tax carbon, go for renewable, and that's simply focused what we should be driving towards. Am I getting it wrong in putting things as simply and crudely as this here?
So, Jeremy, thank you very much. I mean, I think your insights are going to be far more accurate than mine. You've been at the event and you can see, and I think, you know, you've come away with a fairly balanced picture there. On the one hand, you know, summing up the sense of optimism and energy that exists when you get a large number of people together, you know, speaking up an issue and paying attention to something which really has gripped those people and who are there for, you know, quite genuine reasons. And I think that for example, the environment ministers that would have been present would be greatly enthused by, you know, they'll have their national perspectives and they'll have their nationally determined contribution and action plans in their hands, and that they may well go back and, having had the opportunity in Glasgow to have collaborated with some of their peers, you know, with a sense of community there, a community of interest of their own that they can reach out to. I'm sure that a lot of sort of south-south, and as we call it, triangular cooperation ideas were exchanged among countries, and that there is a wellspring of inspiration, technical as well as, you know, goodwill that comes out of these events. And I think that's a good thing that comes out. But equally, I think you're right to be a bit disheartened with it, because even if the president of the event himself is visibly, you know, upset by having an ultimate conference agreement watered down at the 11th hour, and you could see the emotion in his manner there, then, you know, your sense of disheartenment is, you know, is also well-founded. And I think not just because of the countries, for whatever reason, feeling that they're not in a position to ascribe to more ambitious goals, but also being, you know, politically savvy enough to recognize that there are long-standing vested interests in not moving quicker, and that some of those, at least transparently, those came out, and that those were visible, and that you could see the reasons why some countries were not able, it was not necessarily in their best interest to move quite so quickly as others. And so without naming them, they're quite conspicuous. And there are similarly private sector interests which are very powerful lobbying there. And I think that this conference accommodated more private sector and business interests than any other of a similar nature. And we can't be naive to think that they didn't have both a learning objective and to be seen to be on the right side of history, but also, you know, what is it they can do potentially to slow down this process as well. I don't think it's all goodwill, but at least they're, you know, it's better to be in the ring than on the outside of it. And at least they'll have been influenced in some manner as well. I do agree with you that the technical solutions are probably largely there in many arenas, and they've been there for some time. But it's about creating the right incentive structures, as you mentioned. I mean, we've still got countries that provide fuel subsidies, you know, to coal, to these greenhouse gas emitting pollutants. But has has the agenda moved on? It certainly has. And in the year ahead, at least countries have been tasked with coming back with better, sharper plans in a year's time. And I think that there's no mistaking the urgency that's required. But of the senior voices that expressed their perspectives at the end, and some of them are quite respective voices, you know, a deal that, you know, has been done. We've got to, you know, focus on some of the pragmatic achievements that were there, but in many corridors, I think that's seen as a yeah. Thank you for posting that, Malcolm. You know, there are other voices as well. Greenpeace is one of them. The Secretary General was, you know, suggested, well, we've made an agreement, but I think there was a sense of disappointment that was accompanied the, you know, the final outtakes of that voiced from all over. So there's still the need for much more transparency. And I totally agree with you on the point of, you know, some organizations seeing this as a linear, a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of thing. It's far from it. In this arena, a 1 + 1 kind of thing is more of a multiple effect. And so you see the potential for the accumulation of magnitude of challenges and crises ahead if we don't get this right. But I think your picture is much more accurate than mine will ever be since you were present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? You can either raise your hand electronically or by good old analog fashion. While we're waiting, I'd like to just slightly challenge you, Jeremy. You seem quite technologically fixed on solutions, and
Absolutely.
a large part of Ian's presentation was in finding spiritual principles. How do you see that in your vision of the future of climate change? Not so much from even the Jewish faith perspective, but from the perspective of how do we arouse more compassion in the rich nations and the powerful nations, when countries like the Maldives are saying by 2030 we'll be dead. We'll be, you know, they'll have had to flee because, you know, they're going under. We need some also an emotional aspect. Technological fixes are very intellectual, very necessary. I'm not denying that, but there doesn't seem to be enough. The people like Greta Thunberg and the activists are arousing emotions, but mostly emotions of frustration. They don't seem to be a compelling argument for compassion and for justice.
Can I answer your question, Malcolm?
Yes.
I'll do it as quick as I can because there are other people here too, in 4 hopefully brief parts. The first is my Jewish faith. Although my books are written in the Middle Bronze Age, where technology is just that little bit less sophisticated than it is now, and possibly not even remotely appropriate apart from Noah's Ark, perhaps, as a good example of how to get out of the water. Even Noah's Ark, I did an analysis of the descriptions, and I don't think God was a particularly good naval architect, as far as I can work it out. So moving from that, I take a more pragmatic view that, and it's Kwame Anthony Appiah, when the Ruth Lecture said each generation looks at its ancient scriptures through the lens of its own times, and we must each do that. And we will find solutions which are relevant to our times, not the Middle Bronze Age. And we're therefore in the realms of what Yuval Noah Harari's thesis is, that what we need is a story that can inspire cooperation of people who've never met each other. And that story is COP26. That story is the agreement. We have a world problem and we're going to have world solutions. But when it comes to the practical implementation of those, it is going to have to be a practical engineering job, because our problems are created by the Industrial Revolution, which was an engineering success, and is turning into an environmental failure. We have to return to engineering to have a solution to those failures. Regrettably, the Maldives and countries like them, I fear, are going to be the most unfortunate early casualties who cannot be saved, whether it's through lack of ability or lack of sufficient will. And unless we build a wall around those islands and places, I do not believe we shall save those places. We will not be able to save everybody, but when there have been enough sacrifices of enough people, the rest of us will get together, we will agree on a story, and we will implement the solutions for the rest of us, for the sake of humanity. I hope that's my answer anyway.
Very good. Yes, thank you very much. Penny, you're next.
Yeah, I have to confess to sort of my ignorance over the years. You know, we hear about all these Earth summits, world summits, etc. And this one seems to have sort of captured the imagination, one might argue, of, you know, the grassroots, because it's been talked about coming, it's been talked about, you know, 1 minute to midnight, which I think has actually sort of galvanized people into, you know, wow, we really need to take some notice of this, not just the politicians any longer, not just the leaders, not just the environmentalists, but, you know, the likes of, you know, myself, if you will. And I've been really sort of heartened by the grassroots and the young ones. You know, I mean, I go back to the sort of, you know, 60s, where it was all about ban the bomb and all of that, you know, the 70s and sort of nuclear disarmament, and, you know, and now it's the environment. And I guess I'm just hoping that what has happened in this country and the number of ordinary people that have got caught up in sort of COP26 and the environment and the earth shot, that and all the, you know, the Queen and Prince William and Prince Charles and all of that. I just hope that that is happening throughout the world, and I don't have any evidence of that. So I'm just kind of, you know, wondering, because you are at the UN, is whether or not sort of it's actually having the same impact elsewhere.
It's a really great question, Penny. And I think that because we're in the host country, we're probably more aware of it than many others. Certainly at the, how can I say it, the citizen end of the scale. I know that, for example, talking to my colleagues in Papua New Guinea just this last week, of course, at the national level, they are aware of it, but I would be more doubtful, and I know this from the work that we've done in Thailand, for example, where the UN has engaged young people and all segments of the population, for example, in various different exercises to gauge their level of knowledge on the Sustainable Development Goals, that those messages are not getting out there by and large, that people aren't necessarily well informed, whether it's through their school curricula or through efforts of their national local authorities, or, you know, even our own groups, our own religious communities are getting involved in some of these issues, which are, to quote from the presentation, you know, be anxiously concerned with the age in which, or the needs of the age in which you live. And unfortunately, Penny, whilst we may have done a temporary good job in this country, and I'd like to share your, and I do, I think in principle, share you being heartened by the degree to which at the grassroots people are engaged. That's a good sign. I hope it's not just a phenomenon of the fact the COP was hosted in this country, or in fact it was delayed a year, so we had more opportunity to get the word out. But I'm not sure that it's the case everywhere. Clearly that people like Greta, and I appreciate she's not everybody's cup of tea, but that she is managing to be a champion for the voice of young people, whether she represents them or not. She's a figure to which young people can turn. You know, she acts as a catalyst. She says some fairly, you know, assertive and audacious things about the environment. She's got absolutely due right to be concerned about it. You know, she's gone on that strike from school to raise awareness. It's got young people involved, and the children in Glasgow were, and in other parts of the UK were involved in, you know, leaving their schools on certain school days. And, you know, at least that itself promoted a discussion about what's a right and due process to be involved. And so these are all good things, because Greta's point, I think, in the beginning is, what's the point in going to school if I won't have a home to live in because you're going to burn it through the, you know, the effects of climate change. And so anything, I think, at this stage, within, you know, good reason, that gets this as a topic for discussion in and among cohorts of young people can only really be a good thing. I don't see it being of any damaging or long-term harm to people's education if they're involved in such discussions and such debates. I don't think that the world is moving quick enough to integrate it into curriculum. That's a general comment, I think. And that would be interesting to look at the, what do they call it, the PESA scores amongst nations, because they, you know, UNESCO now have a means for tracking education systems and to the extent to which social and environmental issues are integrated in a constructive way into curricula across the education systems around the world, and so forth. But I don't think young people in particular, are sufficiently engaged in their neighborhoods at the grassroots level in these sorts of things. That's my kind of instinct on that.
I like to
let's just let Daisy come in there, Penny. You can come back again after.
Yeah, no, hi, sorry. That was actually really interesting. I was listening to that because I do agree with you completely, that I think that young people are not involved in grassroots as much as they sort of should be. And I think that that's twofold. One of the reasons, I think, is because we're not involved in community particularly. It's not something that's really part of young people's lives anymore. Our community is now online. That's like a predominant feature that I've found. And I think that that's really problematic, because it then means that you don't really care about the people around you. But I think that the second thing, which is relevant to today, to what this meeting is I think that the loss of faith in people, the lack of religion has actually been hugely detrimental. From my perspective, I wasn't raised religious. I chose to kind of to go down this path myself, and I think that it's really important for a kind of like to give you that drive to care at a grassroots level, to give you the drive to want to do your bit. And also, if you then have the capacity to do something on a larger scale, like for me, I find that like my faith is really, it's really important to sort of fuel me, and to allow me to kind of connect with people in a way that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. And you do see that, you see this sort of like this kind of disconnect with most people that you don't have in the same way with people of faith. And I think that it's really like, you're not really allowed to say that now, because it comes across like you have a, you know, it's so funny, because I used to be on the other side of the argument. I used to think that people who were religious were like happy, you know, I had all of those, and now I'm like, no, they were right. Like, religion's really important. We need it. And especially now, it's such a key time with the climate crisis. I think that in response to what you were saying, Jeremy, about renewables, and about advice being given to these people who actually have power and money, I think that there needs to be a lot more money in research and development in renewables. There needs to be a lot more money put into research and development in other environmental, you know, rescues.
Land use especially.
Land use, definitely. And you know, I interact with quite a lot of agriculture students, horticulture students, arboriculture students, land people who care for the land as their careers. And actually, because we're all young people, a lot of them don't have that connection to the land. They don't have that feel that, you know, that we're custodians, as you were saying, Ian, in your PowerPoint. This idea of being a custodian isn't really very, it's not popular anymore. It's not normal. It's not in the kind of like mainstream, and that's the problem. And I think that faith is really important, because without it, it's difficult to have that direction, and it's difficult to have that to see why we need to care for the earth, why we need to care for each other, why it's important for us to make sure that the world can continue spinning. If you don't have that kind of grounding that you get from faith, then it's like, well, of course, why would you care? And I think that's a problem. So we're totally on board with all of you, and I think it's really great that you're all here today. And also, I think young people do need to be involved with it at grassroots level, but I do think there's also an enormous amount of expectations on young people, because of technology and social media, and now everyone's expected to be extraordinary in at least, you know, one area of their life. So it's like, I see why some people become despondent. But anyway, I do agree, we all need to be involved, and there's no excuse not to be. But yeah, that was just a little side. I'll shut up now.
Would you like to say anything in response to that, Ian?
Yeah, I thought it was extremely helpful, actually. There was 3 or 4 things that you made mention of there, Daisy, and I've learned something from what you've said with regard to involving young people. So just a simple soundbite from today. We had to mark Interfaith Week, as you're doing in Preston, we had an event last night, and we had an event today. The event today was a bulb planting, so it was directly related to the environment. And we had representatives of faiths, good turnout, beautiful November day. But then I realized, listening to what you're saying, Daisy, is that, I mean, of course, most of the people there were middle-aged or older, to be diplomatic. And we didn't have any young people because we'd organised it on a school day. And I think, you know, had we a little bit, you know, our wits about us, we might have done it on a Saturday morning or a Saturday afternoon and invited some local schools along. So on reflection, you know, we can definitely do better. Your bigger point, I think, about there is a general loss of faith in society. I think that's huge, and it is significantly detrimental, as you say, and it's probably the greatest challenge at a number of levels. I mean, one is that it has an impact on the more the intangible moral framework that binds us all together as people. Somehow we've had, to give you an example, a universal declaration of human rights in existence for well over half a century, probably nearly 70 years now. I can't remember when it was agreed, but it was around 1947, let's say. But we struggle, nation state after nation state, to be able to come anywhere near to adhering to its principles. And this is the moral framework of the UN system that most countries have signed up to. And there are many different dimensions to it. Too many to go into here. But that reflects on the fact, and the Secretary General of the UN has called it too, in that there is a huge lack of trust in the world presently. And this is why we're not able to get on, I think, at so many levels. And I think that also reflects as one of the spiritual principles we were talking about earlier in the presentation, is that the material, the world that we've created for ourselves, is also a reflection of the spiritual. And I think we can't get away from that. They're inextricably linked. One is like a mirror of the other. And we see both the good in that and the potential, but we also see, you know, the negative side of that and what we've done to our world and what we've managed to keep doing to each other. And so these, if you like, are part of our spiritual health and well-being, about how truly we value each other, and we have some kind of moral code towards one another as well as to the planet. And so I think you touched on it absolutely there, right. But what prospect we have to research in renewables, the point that Jeremy made very well, and that I don't think we've yet got the incentive structures there right. We had an event 10 days ago with the Solihull Council here just down the road from you. And of course, you break it down, Solihull's on a flight path to net zero by 2041, very good, very aspirational. And they know which sectors are the greatest challenges, whether it's transport or domestic properties. But we don't see too many incentives for individual people to do something about their domestic property to make it, a more, to move it in the direction of net zero. And so I wonder, I'm sure lots more could be done. And Bahá'u'lláh says, for every problem, there's a solution. And it comes back to that issue of consultation. We take counsel together. We get science and harmony, science and religion, operating in harmony, and surely we can find answers to these challenges. They're not beyond us.
Maybe Ulrika, as another young person, you would have some something to. Oh, you've already got your hand up. Sorry. I was thinking of you. So fine. Yeah. Let's hear.
That's Malcolm, we know each other from previous Zoom talks, and it's very kind of you to call me a young person. I'm probably about 3 times as old as Daisy, but anyway, I hope my heart and my soul are still as young. No, I'm sorry that I couldn't engage more visually with you all. It seems that my camera has given up the ghost. I'm not sure what's wrong with it, but anyway. My first reaction really is just to say wow about the presentation by Ian. Thank you very much. And also the ensuing discussion. Really, it paints such a big picture of the whole issue, and so much bigger than so much kind of value added to what we've heard, the practical things and what is going on, because I do believe that the spiritual aspect of our lives is just as important as all the material things that are happening which we can see. Anyway, you brought very beautiful quotations from your faith, and I saw so many parallels to the Christian faith, which I feel that I would represent. And obviously it would be so interesting to talk more about this, but just 1 or 2 points that, if I may, which I remember. One of them was when you talked about unity and how important it is to create unity, and even that there are these signs that we are on the way to a more universal unity, but we have to reach that first. So in a way, I'm sure you meant it also like that. It's like the journey is the goal, whilst we are striving to work more together and to be interconnected, we are creating that unity. We won't be able to first have unity and then solve the problems, but kind of also these are so interrelated. And then you started with hope and you finished with hope. And obviously we will, I think we probably all share that hope, even if Jeremy painted quite a dark picture in some ways, especially of the low-lying countries having to pay a huge price perhaps. But it just reminded me of something which Chiara Lubich said, if I may more or less quote her. She's the founders of the Focolare movement. And it also relates to that spiritual being reflected in the material. She's observing the world. She died about 10 years ago, but even observing the world at her stage, she said, it seems like we are going through a spiritual night. The whole world, certainly the Western world, is going through a spiritual night, this darkness which we are experiencing. But with that, we have the hope, like in other examples of great leaders and people. And for example, also Jesus Christ went through a spiritual complete annihilation and darkness in order to arrive somewhere better, bigger, and at the brighter future. So I share that perspective with you as well, hoping that it will lead eventually to a resurrection of mankind, to us being able to live in peace together. But anyway, a question I would have is whether you can see any collaboration between the big faiths, as we mainly focus on faith here. Can you see any, I mean, is there anything developing? Are there any promising signs now that the big world religions have started working together practically to find better ways forward?
Thank you, Ulrika. And Ian?
Yeah, I welcome these comments and these reflections, especially, and thank you for your comments at the outset about the presentation. I mean, look, I think that the striving for unity is a really interesting one, and I think you've captured it well yourself. I mean, it is a common journey. It's a journey that we're on. If we're more united in our efforts, then surely we will be able to attain more faster through those efforts. And I think, as you said, it's about, or I'm maybe putting words into your mouth here, it's about us co-creating that unity. It's not a uniformity, and it's not a unity that can be achieved through coercion. It has to be one that's derived, and I think, through the grassroots, through the efforts of people in their local communities coming together to take action on issues together, to work, to collaborate, to consult, and that unity, the more powerful it will be is to the extent to which it can accommodate diversity. And so it's far from a unity in uniformity. It's a unity in diversity that is capable of being able to reflect, that extraordinary spectrum of views and beliefs, of characteristics that we are as a human family. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's, if you like, one of the starting points. It's got to be all encompassing in that sense. I love your expression on what you're talking about, hope, the reiteration of the spiritual reflecting the material, and in fact, I think we also concur with this notion that we're passing through a spiritual night, but that we should take some solace from the fact that the darkest part of the night is just before the dawn occurs.
Yes, yes, that's
So,
very nice.
it's also a hopeful dimension to that too. It feels like we're in that sort of quite a dark place right now as humanity, but be prepared. It may, I don't want to be the harbinger of doom, but it may get more challenging still.
Yeah.
Before we finally see those streaks of dawn. But maybe we can see some of those streaks of dawn already through the various different. There's a wonderful passage in the Baha'i writings which speaks about 7 lights or 7 candles of unity, and how they will, their light will gradually, increase as time goes on, and it mentions in the various different realms of collective thought, of nations agreeing to cooperate more, the beginnings of the end of racial prejudice and racial disharmony, and so on. These 7 lamps that will gradually glow with increasing incandescence over time, and we begin to see that kind of collaboration at a global scale for whole of humanity take place, but they may only be sort of early glimmerings presently. Yes, and on the question of the collaboration of the big faiths, one of those lamps of lights of unity, if you like, is based around the need for collaboration of the great religious systems. And I'm not so aware or informed. I know that there's a World Parliament of Faiths. I know that there are other similar such movements. And all I would suggest, and their voice is not always as conspicuous in the right way, or heard, I suspect, within the UN system. And the UN system is made up, especially, of course, of the member states, the national member states, and it seeks to reach out to civil society, to private sector, and all sorts of different segments of the global community. But I noticed that the language of the UN is not one which is, necessarily or easily takes on board the spiritual dimensions. And so this is something I think that an agenda for the faith systems, I'm sure they're cognizant of it, I'm sure they're working on it, but I'm no doubt that more could be done in that area to try to infuse some of the language of development, which has a tendency to be very materialistic, let's face it, with some of these spiritual values. And so I think there's a bigger agenda for the faiths to get to grips with. I'm not sure if there's a common statement, for example, on climate change. When I was doing my research recently for an event that we were co-hosting with Solihull Council and the leader of the council, I found a statement from the papacy, the papal statement on climate change. I found one on the Islamic Declaration on climate change. I found a few others from different faith communities. I have to confess I didn't work terribly hard to find a unifying statement, but I drew from all of them to find some unifying perspective. But it may be that the World Parliament or the World Council of Faiths have got something on this issue. It wasn't readily available at my fingertips, but I'm sure it's an agenda item that needs more work.
Thank you very much. What springs to mind is that perhaps there too we have to hope for shoots like coming from the grassroots, from events like what we are doing tonight on an interfaith level.
Most definitely.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Penny, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, just on that point that, taking on sort of point of really all that's been said about sort of faith is that it's the first year that we've ever actually had a faith minister, and that's been brought about by the sort of pandemic, because the government has finally woken up to the fact that the amount of work that the faith communities have actually done, to help mankind during the sort of pandemic, you know, they're the, you know, the volunteers, the willings, the whatever, that their voice needs to be heard. So maybe things will start to change a little on that, you know, on that front. I'm not saying it's for, how can I say it? I'm not saying it's for great motives, but I think sort of, you know, it's a start because it's not something we've had before. I think the other thing is sort of what, you know, just on a sort of small scale, I don't even really know why it came to mind, but it was like, you know, we had the Paralympics and it made such an enormous difference in the world. You know, it was sort of like, you know, suddenly it was like, we've had Paralympics before, but somehow or other, this one seemed to have an impact, so much so that the government and policies, work employment policies, you know, I mean, I've never seen so many people with special needs, you know, presenting programs and things. So it goes to show that if there is a desire and a need and a want, and the young people and, you know, whatever age we are, get behind that, and the government sort of helps back that, then, you know, we can actually achieve a lot quite quickly.
Thank you.
I'll respond to that just briefly. I mean, I think it's a great point. I mean, the pandemic has taught us a lot, however horrifying it has been and continues to be. You know, the pandemic itself, the virus doesn't discriminate. Humanity is one. We're all affected in that sense. We're interconnected. But it's also been apparent here in Solihull too that you know, that the faiths community were also a service provider. Many communities became service providers, looking out for their neighbours in these times, and that, you know, communities re-emerged to some extent to help to respond to it, just out of the pure humanity of it. In Solihull, there was a sort of an audit done some years ago before the pandemic, that the faith communities, when you add up all the voluntary work that is done in the community by those faith groups, it amounts to somewhere between £2 and £4 million every year. It's not an insignificant sum of voluntary work, and that, you know, these are significant things. But the pandemic has brought, I think, to the fore the work that the faith communities do, and that the interfaith community here in Solihull does. And I think in the same way that you make mention there of the Paralympics, it raises awareness of social issues and helps us to overcome some issues of stigma as well. So we have to learn the lessons that come out of it, as I think you're also saying.
Mm. I mean, certainly in Preston, I mean, you know, we have 300 volunteers in the hospital. And if those 300 volunteers tomorrow decided I'm not coming in, you know, the hospital would be in quite a state. But I do, you know, as I say, I mean, I think it's a move forward from the governmental point of view, just having a, you know, an actual faith minister.
Okay. Right. Well, we're just coming up to 8 o'clock, so I think that we've had a really good discussion and some really comprehensive take on the subject, and I can't thank you enough, Ian, for your brilliant exposition and your capturing the essence of the topics. It takes a clever person to make something simple, and I think the simpleness of your slides and that encompassed a real depth of knowledge. And likewise, our contributors, thank you all for your contributions, which I think Ian again handled really with great understanding of the questions and the comments. So thank you everyone enormously for your contributions and for coming tonight. And I will be posting this up on my YouTube channel. If anyone wants to invite a friend to watch it or so on, if they think it was really good and they want someone to see it. I don't get money for my YouTube channel, I hasten to add. I'm not monetized. It's purely and simply so people who didn't get the chance and want to see it can see it. So that should go up, if not tonight, tomorrow. So thank you again, everybody, and big round of applause for you and for Ian. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, everybody. I enjoyed it, although I kept quiet tonight, but it was very, very interesting from everybody's contributions. Thank you so much.
And likewise, Malcolm, thanks for inviting me, and thank you to all the participants. It's been really interesting, really interesting.
Good luck, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Good night.